The night of January 3rd, 2026, will be forever etched into the history of the Western Hemisphere, not for the chaos of battle, but for the terrifying precision of the silence that preceded it. At exactly 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the vibrant, chaotic hum of Caracas was extinguished in an instant as a sophisticated, multi-vector cyber attack overwhelmed the SCADA systems controlling the nation's power grid, plunging the capital and the heavily fortified Fuerte Tayuna military complex into absolute darkness. This was not the erratic flickering of Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure, but a deliberate, weaponized blackout designed to blind the air defense radar arrays and sever the command and control links between the Miraflores Palace and the loyalist military leadership. In those confusing first minutes, as backup generators sputtered and failed due to pre-planted malware, the only sound piercing the oppressive tropical night was the low-frequency thrum of stealth transport rotors cutting through the humid air above the city. Residents in the southern districts reported hearing a series of dull, concussive thuds, sound-suppressed breaches, and precision munition strikes targeting the anti-aircraft batteries at La Carlota Air Base, marking the commencement of a unilateral intervention that would shatter the geopolitical status quo. The psychological impact of the darkness cannot be overstated. It stripped the regime of its eyes and ears, turning their fortress into a trap and creating the necessary fog of war for the United States to execute the most audacious extraterritorial extraction operation since the invasion of Panama in 1989. To understand the kinetic violence of 2026, one must rewind to the diplomatic heartbreak of 2024, the year that effectively sealed the fate of the Chavista regime and set the United States on a collision course with Caracas. The presidential election of that year was intended to be the culmination of the Barbados Agreements, a roadmap toward democratization that promised sanctions relief in exchange for a free and fair vote. But instead, it devolved into what international observers call the most brazen electoral theft of the 21st century. Opposition candidate Edmundo González Urrutia had mobilized a weary population, securing a landslide victory that was undeniable in the streets but completely erased by the regime-controlled National Electoral Council, which simply fabricated a victory for Maduro without releasing the granular voting data. The subsequent crackdown was brutal and swift, as the regime arrested thousands of protesters, forced González into exile, and severed diplomatic channels with the few remaining Western nations willing to negotiate. This betrayal hardened the resolve of the incoming Trump administration, which viewed the 2024 stolen election not merely as a diplomatic failure, but as a confirmation that Venezuela had transitioned from a rogue state to a criminal enterprise that could no longer be managed through traditional statecraft. The failure of 2024 stripped away the arguments of the doves in Washington, creating a bipartisan consensus that the diplomatic toolbox was empty and providing the moral justification for a shift from containment to direct, decapitating action. Long before the first boot hit the ground in Caracas, the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency had begun constructing an intricate intelligence architecture designed to penetrate the paranoid inner circle of the Venezuelan leadership. Throughout 2025, while the world was distracted by conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, American intelligence case officers were quietly cultivating a high-level asset within the Presidential Guard, a source motivated not by ideology, but by the regime's internal purges and the realization that the ship was sinking. This asset provided the pattern of life analysis that was critical for the operation, detailing Maduro's erratic sleep schedule, his obsession with security protocols, and the specific rotation of his Cuban bodyguards. Simultaneously, thousands of miles away in a classified facility in the American South, elements of the Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta were conducting relentless rehearsals in a mock house that was a near-perfect architectural replica of Maduro's safe house inside the military fortress. These rehearsals were exhaustive and granular, accounting for every blind corner, every reinforced door, and every potential escape route, utilizing data harvested from satellite imagery and the HUMINT provided by the mole in Caracas. This phase of the operation, known as preparation of the environment, was a masterclass in modern tradecraft, merging cyber surveillance with old-school spycraft to ensure that when the operators finally breached the room, they had already fought the battle 100 times in the rehearsal facility. The raid itself, codenamed Operation Red Liberty, was a masterwork of synchronized violence and speed, lasting less than 45 minutes from the initial breach to the extraction, a time frame so compressed that the Venezuelan military's reaction force was still mobilizing when the American helicopters were already lifting off. The Delta Force operators, equipped with panoramic night vision goggles and suppressed carbines, fast-roped onto the roof of the residence, while a secondary team established a perimeter to hold back any loyalist reinforcements. The firefight that ensued was intense but one-sided. The elite American operators utilized flashbangs and overwhelming firepower to neutralize the Cuban security detail guarding the presidential suite, moving with a fluidity that stunned the defenders. Inside the residence, the confusion caused by the cyber-induced blackout played a pivotal role as the operators breached the reinforced panic room where Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, had taken refuge. Unlike the chaotic images often associated with regime change, the capture was conducted with clinical professionalism. There were no summary executions, only the swift application of flex cuffs and the immediate securing of a high-value target. The extraction was the most perilous phase, as the MH-60 Blackhawks had to navigate out of hostile airspace that was slowly waking up to the invasion, flying low over the Avila Mountain range to evade the few remaining active radar systems before reaching the safety of the USS Iwo Jima, an amphibious assault ship waiting in international waters. As the sun rose over a confused and leaderless Caracas, the narrative battle began in earnest from the White House, where President Donald Trump took to Truth Social to deliver a message that was equal parts victory lap and geopolitical ultimatum. His announcement was carefully calibrated to frame the operation not as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, but as a necessary law enforcement action against the head of a narco-terrorist empire that had been flooding American streets with fentanyl and cocaine. By invoking the war on cartels, a central pillar of his second-term domestic policy, Trump effectively bypassed the traditional constraints of international law in the eyes of his base, categorizing Maduro not as a president, but as a kingpin equivalent to El Chapo. The rhetoric was stark and uncompromising, declaring that the era of leading from behind was over and that the United States would no longer tolerate a criminal sanctuary in its own hemisphere. This messaging was designed to preempt domestic criticism by linking the raid directly to the safety of American families, arguing that the flow of drugs and migrants from Venezuela was a direct national security threat that required a military solution. The administration released a declassified photo of a disheveled Maduro in U.S. custody almost immediately, an image designed to shatter the myth of the dictator's invincibility and force the world to accept the new reality on the ground before diplomatic protests could gain momentum. The physical extraction of Nicolás Maduro was merely the prelude to an unprecedented legal war, as the theater of conflict shifted from the barrios of Caracas to the sterile, wood-paneled courtrooms of the Southern District of New York. The Department of Justice immediately unsealed a superseding indictment charging Maduro and his inner circle with narco-terrorism, corruption, and drug trafficking, leveraging the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO, Act to frame the Venezuelan state apparatus as a criminal enterprise. This legal strategy was fraught with complexity, as it required the United States to argue that Maduro's claim to sovereign immunity, a principle that generally protects sitting heads of state from foreign prosecution, was void because his presidency was illegitimate following the stolen 2024 election. Legal scholars and defense attorneys immediately began preparing for what would be the trial of the century, citing the precedent of Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator captured and tried by the U.S. in roughly similar circumstances decades prior. However, the legal landscape of 2026 is far more complex than that of 1989. The defense is expected to argue that the capture was an act of war and a kidnapping, challenging the jurisdiction of the U.S. courts and threatening to turn the trial into a protracted examination of American foreign policy. The Justice Department remains undeterred, betting that the sheer volume of evidence regarding the cartel of the Suns, the drug trafficking ring allegedly run by the Venezuelan military, will be sufficient to secure a conviction and legally justify the regime change. The shockwaves of the operation fractured Latin America instantly, tearing open the ideological fault lines that have defined the region's politics for decades and creating a diplomatic crisis that the Organization of American States seemed powerless to manage. On one side, right-leaning governments in Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador openly celebrated the removal of Maduro, with leaders like Javier Milei issuing statements that praised the operation as a necessary liberation of the Venezuelan people and a victory for liberty. On the other side, the leftist bloc led by Brazil's Lula da Silva, Colombia's Gustavo Petro, and Mexico's leadership condemned the raid with ferocious rhetoric, labeling it an imperialist aggression that violated the most sacred tenet of Latin American diplomacy, non-intervention. Colombia, which shares a porous and volatile border with Venezuela, immediately mobilized troops to the frontier, fearing that the power vacuum in Caracas would spill over in the form of refugee waves or armed conflict between rival military factions. This polarization has effectively paralyzed regional cooperation, creating a diplomatic Cold War in South America, where nations are now forced to choose between aligning with a U.S. intervention or standing in solidarity with the principle of sovereignty, regardless of the nature of the deposed regime. The unity of the region, always fragile, has been shattered, perhaps irreparably, as neighbors view each other with suspicion over their stance on the American raid. Back in Caracas, the removal of the autocrat did not bring immediate freedom, but rather a terrifying and dangerous power vacuum that threatened to spiral into a Somali-style civil conflict. The structure of the Chavista state was designed specifically to resist internal dissent, but it was not built to function without its central figurehead. As a result, the chain of command disintegrated within hours of the news breaking. Various factions within the military, the Bolivarian National Guard, and the feared colectivos, armed paramilitary gangs loyal to the regime, began to turn on one another, fighting for control of territory, weapon stockpiles, and drug routes. General Pedrino Lopez, the longtime defense minister and power broker, found himself in a precarious position, attempting to maintain order while being pressured by the U.S. to facilitate a transition and threatened by hardliners who viewed any negotiation as treason. The streets of the capital became a no-man's land where confused citizens, eager for change but terrified of the violence, stayed locked in their homes as sporadic gunfire echoed through the neighborhoods. The opposition, led by figures who had been in hiding or exile, struggled to assert authority in this chaotic environment, realizing that removing the dictator was the easy part, and that dismantling the criminal infrastructure he left behind would be a bloody, years-long undertaking. Beyond the Western Hemisphere, the capture of Maduro represented a direct and humiliating challenge to the revisionist powers of Russia and China, both of which had invested billions of dollars and significant political capital in propping up the Venezuelan regime. Moscow, which had viewed Venezuela as a strategic beachhead in America's backyard, reacted with fury, putting its nuclear forces on high alert and denouncing the operation as an act of international piracy that set a dangerous precedent for global stability. For Vladimir Putin, the loss of Maduro was a strategic blow, removing a key ally who had allowed Russian warships to dock in the Caribbean and provided a platform for Russian influence in Latin America. Beijing's reaction was more calculated but equally severe, concerned primarily with the repayment of massive loans and the security of its oil investments. China issued stern warnings against any U.S. seizure of Venezuelan assets, signaling that it would use its economic leverage to punish Washington. The operation forced these global powers to confront the reality that despite their inroads, the United States retained the capability and the will to enforce the Monroe Doctrine by force when pushed. It was a geopolitical checkmate that reset the board, forcing Russia and China to reassess the viability of their alliances with vulnerable dictatorships far from their own borders. As the dust settles on Operation Red Liberty, the future of Venezuela remains a haze of uncertainty, suspended between the promise of democratic renewal and the abyss of failed state chaos. The United States has proposed a trusteeship model, a controversial plan to oversee the country's transition to democracy and the reconstruction of its oil industry, effectively placing Venezuela under international guardianship, a move that critics decry as modern colonialism. The success of this gambit depends entirely on the U.S. administration's willingness to engage in nation-building, a task for which the American public has little appetite after decades of forever wars. If the transition fails, Venezuela could fracture into fiefdoms run by warlords, creating a permanent security crisis in the Caribbean. If it succeeds, it could mark the beginning of an economic miracle for a nation sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. Ultimately, the legacy of January 3rd, 2026 will not be decided by the precision of the raid, but by what rises from the ashes of the Chavista state. The capture of Nicolás Maduro was the end of a chapter, but the story of Venezuela's struggle for sovereignty and stability is far from over, leaving the world to watch with bated breath to see if liberty can truly be imposed from the barrel of a gun.